About 3 years ago, something extremely bizarre happened to us in the Appalachian Mountains. Well, technically, it didn't happen to me directly, but to my friend Banner. My childhood group of friends always loved hiking trails. For a long time, it was just the four of us adventurers. But as we grew older, the group expanded. New friends joined in occasionally, and more often, it was the girlfriends of some of the guys. That particular time, there were 6 of us. Me, Elijah, Robert, Banner, Claire, Robert's girlfriend, and Denise, Banner's girlfriend. We planned to hike part of the famous Appalachian Trail and camp at pre-identified spots along the way. After 3 days of hiking, we came across a side trail, branching off from the main path. Elijah, who had always been a wizard with a map and compass, asked if we were up for exploring the less obvious route. Without hesitation, we agreed. As the day went on, the sky began to darken. We decided to look for a spot to set up camp and found a small clearing, overgrown with tall grass but stable enough to spend the night. When night fell, everything seemed normal. We were just finishing up dinner when Banner announced that he needed to step away to pee. It seemed trivial, something all of us had done countless times. But then, time began to drag on, and we started to realize he was taking too long. At first, we joked that maybe he was doing something more involved. But after half an hour, we started to get worried. Denise, visibly upset, decided to go look for him. Less than 5 minutes later, she came back, clearly shaken, saying she couldn't find him anywhere. Panic began to set in. We dropped everything and started searching for him. We called out his name repeatedly, but there was no response. Trying to stay calm, I suggested something that still haunts me to this day. Maybe he was just messing with us. Banner had a history of pulling pranks like this. Once, he disappeared for over an hour at the beach while I searched for him in a panic, only for me to find him at the bar, watching and laughing. That memory made us hesitate, delaying the realization that something far more serious might be happening. We searched and kept on searching. Hours went by before we finally accepted the gravity of the situation. Banner was missing, and we needed help. Still, before contacting the police, we kept searching on our own, combing through the area around the campsite. To this day, I don't know why it took us so long to act. It wasn't intentional. None of us wanted to believe that something truly bad could have happened. The area was dense, with limited visibility, and below the campsite was a small creek. We voted to search there, thinking maybe he'd fallen, but we didn't find any trace of him. While searching, I slightly twisted my ankle. It wasn't serious, but it was enough for the group to decide I should stay at the campsite in case Banner returned. At first, I stayed by the fire, but the flickering light only made the darkness around me seem more oppressive. I felt uneasy and vulnerable. After all, we were in the Appalachian Mountains, a place infamous for stories of disappearances and mysteries. Eventually, I decided I'd feel safer in the tent. But it didn't take long before I heard a noise outside. Something was rustling through our stuff. I called out for Banner, panicked, but there was no answer. I stayed perfectly still, trying to listen. When the sound stopped and I gathered enough courage to open the tent and peek out, there was nothing there, just the fire, almost burned out. I was genuinely terrified and completely alone, so I did the only thing that made sense to my brain at the time. I convinced myself that my imagination was playing tricks on me, and that nothing was really happening. That's when I heard it. A sound that still haunts me to this day. It was the soft humming of a melody. It sounded like a young girl. It wasn't the sound itself that was terrifying, but the context. We were in the middle of nowhere, and there were no children around. I was on the verge of a full-blown panic attack when the sound suddenly stopped. I turned off my phone's flashlight and stayed completely still for what felt like hours, but was really just a few minutes. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out again, everything was exactly as before. Silent, dark, and utterly terrifying. Not long after, the group returned, exhausted and defeated. When I told them what had happened, we all agreed it was time to face the truth. Something was out there in the woods, and something had happened to Banner. We needed help, urgently. We hiked up to higher ground to try and get a signal on Elijah's GPS and contact the authorities. Thankfully, it worked. But what happened next only made things even stranger. A full search was launched through every area we'd passed, but for 4 days, there was no trace of Banner. Then, on the 5th day, a couple hiking miles away from where we had been found him. He was in a state of complete confusion, almost as if he were intoxicated. They reported that he seemed aggressive, which was completely out of character. Banner had always been calm and would never hurt a fly. He was taken straight to the hospital, where tests showed his system was full of drugs, something none of us could comprehend. Banner had never been into that kind of thing, and neither had any of us. To this day, Banner says he doesn't remember anything. The last thing he recalls is seeing a slight glow in a tree as he walked away from us. That caught his attention, and after that, there's nothing. Since then, we've tried to make sense of what happened that night, but all we've found are more questions. And I still can't explain the sound I heard. The faint, haunting hum of that melody. Hey, horror spectator here. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you're always in the loop when new videos drop. We post 2 videos every week. If you're really into this content, consider sharing it with your friends. It really helps us grow this community. Now, let's move on to the second story. About 7 years ago, I decided to take on a trail on Black Mountain, one of the peaks in the Appalachian Mountains, located in Kentucky. While the main trail doesn't pass directly through Black Mountain, the surrounding region is part of the vast and winding chain of mountains that the trail does cover. I'd already hiked many parts of the Appalachian Trail, especially the more well-known sections, but this was the first time I'd ventured into this particular area. What drew me in most was the reputation that Black Mountain had. In Kentucky, it's known as a place of paranormal activity, with tales of shadowy figures, inexplicable sounds, and an eerie sense of dread that hangs in the air, making it one of the more unsettling spots on the map. Of course, I'd always been the skeptic. I've never believed in ghost stories or rumors about haunted places, so, to me, it seemed like just another challenge, no different than any other trail I'd hiked before. I thought I'd be fine. What never crossed my mind, not even once, was the possibility that there were groups, cult-like groups, that might use the mountain's eerie reputation to operate under the radar. That's something I wouldn't understand until it was too late. The day I set out, everything seemed ordinary. I had parked my car near an old mining road that had long been abandoned, its surface cracked and overgrown with weeds. It was early winter, and the air carried the crispness of the season. My pack was light but efficient. I'd packed water, protein bars, a lightweight tent, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. The trail started easily enough, a gentle incline with a well-trodden path. As I climbed higher, though, the forest began to change. The colors seemed to fade, replaced by darker, denser underbrush. The trees grew closer together, their trunks twisted as if shaped by years of struggle against the wind. I remember pausing to look around, realizing how quiet it had gotten. At that moment, I realized something else. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping birds, buzzing insects, the rustling of leaves, were completely absent. It felt unnervingly unnatural. And if there's one thing I've learned from years of exploring, it's this. The real danger isn't when the forest is alive with noise. The true danger comes when everything falls silent, still, and motionless, waiting, as if something is about to happen. The first sign that something was wrong came about 3 hours in. I'd reached a clearing where the trail forked. My map didn't show this split, and neither did my GPS. Both paths were faint and overgrown, as though neither had been used in years. I took the left path, trusting my gut and figuring I could always double back if needed. As I continued, the trail became more difficult to follow. Rocks and roots jutted out at odd angles, and the canopy overhead grew thicker, casting everything in a dim green light. I started seeing strange markings on the trees, crude carvings like scratches. At first, I assumed they were from animals, maybe bears sharpening their claws, but the marks were too deliberate, too human. About an hour after I'd taken the left fork, I realized I hadn't seen another trail marker or any sign of human activity in a long time. The path was barely a path anymore, just a faint depression in the earth. I was considering turning back when I heard it, a sound I can't put into words. All I know is that everything within me shifted. My heart raced as if I were sprinting, and every hair on my body stood on end. It came from somewhere ahead, echoing faintly through the trees. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But as I've always known, men are capable of making incredibly stupid decisions, and so curiosity got the better of me. I think in this sense, women tend to be much more perceptive, and at the first sign of danger, they choose the better option. I crept forward, careful to stay as quiet as possible. The sound grew louder, a low rhythmic hum. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something deeply unsettling about the tone. Then I saw them. Through a break in the trees, I spotted a group of people gathered in a small clearing. They were dressed in dark old clothing, some wearing giant hoods, their faces obscured. In the center of the group was a crude altar made of wood, with something lying on the top of it. I couldn't tell what it was from my vantage point, but the sight of it made my stomach churn. I knew I had to get out of there. Slowly, I started backing away, trying to retrace my steps. But as I turned, I stepped on a dry branch, the sharp crack splitting the silence. The sound stopped instantly. I didn't wait to see if they'd heard me. I bolted, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise I made. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that clearing as possible. My heart pounded in my chest, and adrenaline surged through me as I ran, my legs burning with effort. After what felt like an eternity, I stopped to catch my breath. I crouched behind a tree, straining to hear any sounds of pursuit. At first there was nothing, just the sound of my own labored breathing. Then I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, deliberate and steady, coming from the direction I'd fled. And then an arrow, which landed squarely in the tree where I was, just a few mere inches above my head. They were following me, hunting me. Panic set in. I ran again, not caring about direction, just trying to escape. But the forest seemed to work against me. The terrain grew more treacherous, the ground slippery with moss and littered with rocks. I slipped and fell multiple times, each time scrambling back to my feet. My hands and knees scraped raw. As night fell, the forest became a maze of shadows. My flashlight cast weak beams of light, barely cutting through the darkness. I kept moving, knowing that if I stopped, they would find me. At some point, I stumbled into an old mining tunnel, its entrance hidden by overgrowth. I ducked inside, and it was pitch black, but I felt safer with the solid walls around me. I moved deeper into the tunnel, using my flashlight to guide the way. I went as far as I could into the tunnel, deeper and deeper, until the cold became unbearable. It felt as if I was facing a choice: either freeze to death here, or risk dying at the hands of those people. I knew without a doubt that I preferred the cold. Nothing could make me turn back and confront them. I kept walking until my legs gave out. Exhaustion hit me hard, and I slumped to the ground, resigned to my fate. I truly thought this was the end. I don't know how long I sat there, steeped in despair, before I heard a sound. Like a metal hatch being opened, followed by muffled voices. Panic gripped me again. My first thought was that they'd found me, but as I strained to listen, I realized it wasn't them. The voices were calm, normal, just two people talking. Curiosity stirred within me, overtaking the fear for a moment. The words were faint, and I could only make out fragments, but they weren't threatening. It sounded like two men discussing the structure of the tunnel. I moved cautiously toward the voices, the dim light from my dying flashlight barely illuminating the way. Finally, I came upon two young men, about 6 years younger than me. They were standing near a faintly lit section of the tunnel, inspecting the walls and filming for what I later learned was their YouTube channel. At first, they panicked. One of them even pointed a gun at me, shouting for me to stay back. I raised my hands and managed to explain myself quickly, desperate not to be mistaken for a threat. After a tense moment, they lowered the weapon and listened to my story. Their car was less than 2 kilometers from the tunnel, and they offered me some of their food, which gave me a much-needed boost of energy. For the first time in hours, I felt hope. By the time we reached their car, the relief was so overwhelming that I could hardly speak. They drove me to the nearest hospital, where I stayed for a day. I underwent a few tests, and apart from being physically wrecked and suffering a mild concussion from one of my falls, I was okay. Since then, it goes without saying that I've never gone hiking alone again. I still love the wilderness, but I've joined a Facebook group of people who hike in teams. It's not the same as the solitary treks I once enjoyed, but hiking in groups has its advantages. Looking back, I often wonder what might have happened if I hadn't heard those voices, or if I'd gone just a little further into that tunnel. The experience taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Some places are best left unexplored, and sometimes survival comes down to sheer luck. I've been a hiker for as long as I can remember. But it wasn't until I lost my cousin that it became something more than just a pastime. He wasn't just a cousin. He was like a brother to me. He'd been the one to introduce me to hiking, dragging me out on trails when we were kids, teaching me how to read maps, and sharing stories about the beauty and solitude of nature. When he passed away suddenly, hiking became my way of honoring him, a connection to the memories we'd built together. I'd heard about the Appalachian Mountains more times than I could count. Stories of their beauty, their history, and their eerie mysteries were everywhere. Most people might shy away from such a place, but for me, it felt like a challenge, an invitation. After months of planning, I finally decided to explore a lesser-known part of the range. It was meant to be a quiet, reflective trip. Just me, the forest, and my thoughts. I parked my car at a small gravel pull-off at the edge of the trail. There was one other vehicle there, a beat-up old truck that looked like it had been sitting there for days. I didn't think much of it. I geared up, checked my phone, no service, just the way I liked it, and began my hike. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, but I welcomed the challenge. The dense canopy above let in only scattered shafts of sunlight, creating a calm but slightly eerie atmosphere. The first couple of miles were uneventful. I stopped occasionally to take in the surroundings, snapping a few photos and making mental notes of landmarks. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. But about 2 hours into the hike, I began to notice something that set my nerves on edge. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination. Being alone in the woods has a way of playing tricks on your mind. Besides, I have to admit that I've always been a bit over the top when it comes to this kind of feeling. My friends and family often say I have a persecution complex. That used to irritate me, but as I got older, I learned to accept that they might be right. Because of that, before jumping to hasty conclusions, I always give the situation some time. but the feeling persisted. Every so often, I'd hear the faint crunch of leaves behind me. When I stopped, it stopped. When I moved, it started again. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, and pushed on. I've come across plenty of animals on my hikes, and honestly, despite what people say, animals aren't looking for trouble. They just want to go about their lives, and if we respect that, things rarely escalate. Ever since I was a kid, my cousin taught me to appreciate and respect the life that thrives in these forests. The trail became steeper, winding its way up a ridge. I slowed my pace to catch my breath and noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a faint trail branching off from the main path. It was barely visible, more of a gap in the underbrush than a trail, but something about it caught my attention. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow it. The trail led me to a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. A makeshift campsite. It was crude but functional. A circle of logs around a fire pit, a tarp strung between two trees, and a few supplies scattered around. What struck me most was the sense of urgency in the setup. It didn't look like a place where someone had been camping for leisure. It looked like a hideout. Then I noticed a collection of things that made me deeply uneasy. In one corner, there was a pile of supplies, knives, ropes, and something that genuinely turned my stomach. A chain and a handcuff lying at the bottom. This wasn't a hunter's camp, at least not someone hunting animals. That handcuff wasn't meant for wildlife, it was meant for people. That's when I knew I wasn't alone. I'd stumbled onto someone's territory, and the realization sent a jolt of fear through me. I turned back the way I'd come, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. My heart was racing as I scanned the forest, every rustle and shadow making me jumpy. I hadn't gone far when I heard them. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy, coming from somewhere behind me. This wasn't an animal. There were at least two sets, moving with a confidence that told me they weren't just hikers. They were following me. Panic surged, but I forced myself to stay calm. Running blindly through the forest would only get me lost or injured. I needed to stay focused. I pulled up the map on my phone, praying the GPS would still work. It did, but I had to move fast. I plotted a semicircular route that would take me back to the main trail, avoiding the direction of the footsteps. The forest felt darker now, the trees pressing in around me. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my pulse racing. I tried to move quietly, but it felt impossible. The footsteps behind me grew louder, more insistent. At one point, I glanced over my shoulder and caught a glimpse of movement. A figure in dark clothing slipping between the trees. My breath caught in my throat. There was no mistaking it now. I was being hunted. I think there's a moment in every hiker's life when they realize they'd rather face a wild animal capable of killing them than a completely unhinged person with unknown intentions. It's in that moment when this thought really sinks in, that genuine panic sets in. I quickened my pace, nearly tripping over roots and rocks as I navigated the uneven terrain. The forest seemed to close in around me, each shadow hiding potential danger. I couldn't afford to think about what would happen if they caught up to me. I just had to keep moving. Then, up ahead, I saw it. The faint outline of the main trail. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The footsteps behind me were closer now, accompanied by the occasional low murmur of voices. I didn't dare turn around. I sprinted the last few yards to the trail, my legs burning with effort. As I reached the trail, I spotted a figure in the distance. My first thought was that it was one of them, but as I got closer, I realized it was a park ranger. A man in a green uniform with a wide-brimmed hat. I'd never been so relieved to see anyone in my life. Someone must have reported the campsite, perhaps concerned about an unauthorized fire. I stumbled toward him, breathless and wide-eyed, and managed to explain the situation. His expression shifted immediately to one of concern, and without hesitation, he radioed for backup, relaying my description of the men and their campsite. I ran until I saw the glint of my car through the trees. Relief hit me like a wave. But as I got closer, something stopped me in my tracks. The truck that had been parked there earlier was gone. My car was the only one left. When I reached my car, I noticed something was wrong. All of my tires were slashed. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, meant to leave me stranded, vulnerable, and helpless. Panic surged through me, but there was no time to waste. I didn't know if they were still nearby or what else they might do. My heart raced as I fumbled to get into the car, locked the doors, and tried to start the engine. But I couldn't escape yet. I had to wait for help. When the Rangers finally arrived, I was exhausted, more mentally than physically. They helped me out of there, but they couldn't take away the image of those slashed tires, a clear sign that everything had been part of a plan. That feeling of being watched stayed with me long after I'd left the woods. To this day, that incident still plays on a loop in my mind. In the 2 years since, I've barely hiked, only venturing into areas I know well and near my house. I hope one day, I'll regain the confidence to explore more. But I know that day hasn't come yet.